Hello everyone, Simon3D here, and today I've got a real treat for you guys. As you can see, it's an aura type effect, loosely inspired by the Dragon Ball Super Saiyan effect, and because it's fully procedural and it's based on the particle system, you can apply it to literally anything, whether it's a static object or an animated character, so that makes it even more awesome. And I don't know about you guys, but in my opinion, this video alone is enough reason to subscribe to this channel, so make sure you do, enable that notifications, and let's go. Also, before we start, if you don't feel like following the tutorial or you just want the blend file, you can get it on my Gumroad for free, link in the description, but I encourage you to follow the tutorial, so maybe you'll learn something you didn't know before, who knows. Also, if you manage to use it in your scene, then let me know on Twitter, I would really love to see your creativity. Link for that is in the description as well. So with all that out of the way, let's go with the tutorial. Let's open a fresh Blender scene and import our character. I got mine from Mixamo, but you can use whatever you want. It can even be a simple cube. The effect is gonna work either way. But on Mixamo you have the characters with the animations, so I think that's just that much cooler if you want to use this effect on. So with the character imported, let's check if it works. Seems to work perfectly. And as I mentioned before, this effect is based on particle systems. So let's start with that. Let's create our first particle. It's gonna be a meta ball, so Shift A, meta ball, move it aside. Also scale it down because it's way too big right now. And first of all, go to this meta ball settings and make sure that the resolution viewport is not too high for your computer because it can get laggy when we start dealing with particles. The bigger the number, the less resolution the meta ball will have and the smoother it will run. The render resolution you can leave as you want. Now with the meta ball selected, let's drag in a new viewport and change it to shader editor. Click N to get rid of this ribbon and click new to create a new material. The meta ball is gonna be our electric sparks. So let's name it and delete the principled BSDF. Now let's create an emission, transparent BSDF and a mix shader. Now connect those like so, transparent on top, emission on the bottom, and let's start making our electricity effect. First we will need a Voronoi texture, actually two of them, so we can duplicate that. Make sure that both of them are set to 4D and that the top one is F1 and the second one is smooth F1. Now let's zoom in on our meta ball in this viewport and change the view to rendered. Then here in the graph editor, let's add a math node and change it to subtract. Now connect both distances to this math node, and now let's preview the subtract node. If you don't know how to preview, you have to have a node wrangler enabled, and then click Ctrl Shift and left mouse button on the node that you want to preview. And the node wrangler you can enable through Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, and just look for it here. Now with one of this Voronoi texture selected, click Ctrl T to get a mapping and texture coordinate node and change from generated to object. Now let's move it a little bit to the side to make more space here. Now let's add a value node and connect it to the scale so we can control all three axes at the same time. And let's duplicate this value node twice because one will go into the W value, which is the seed of our noise. And the second one is going to go to scale so that if we change the value, both of the scale will change uniformly. Also make sure that both of the Voronoi texture are connected to the mapping node. Like so. For now, set the value node that goes into scale to 1. Also to make it more organized, you can click on this value node, then press N to get the ribbon back, and you can put in the label scale so that at any moment you know where it goes and you don't have to look for the noodles and see where it's connected. Same with this value node, you can change it to seed and you can press N to hide the ribbon again. Now let's get a noise texture and a mix RGB node. Now connect this noise texture to the mapping node and then noise texture color goes into mix RGB color and also the mapping goes into another color of the mix RGB. Now change the mix to linear light and if you preview that, you can see that our UVs are getting distorted by this noise texture, which in turn, if we connect it to the vector of the Voronoi texture, which is gonna give us this noisy pattern that looks closer to the electricity than what we had before. So let's not make it as extreme, let's bring down the factor of the linear light, like so. This looks good enough. I know it doesn't look like electricity yet, but just bear with me. And soon everything will make sense, I promise. Now with this setup, we can bring another node called layer weight. We can always come back here later and then tweak those values to adjust our final effect. But for now, let's bring a color ramp and connect the layer weight Fresnel to the color ramp factor. Now, if we preview that, you can see that the meta ball edges, no matter how we turn the camera, are always brighter than the middle. And that is precisely what we want. We want this to act as a mask that will only show the electricity sparks on the edges of the metal ball. So in order to do that, let's move those nodes away a little bit and bring in another math node, put it right here, and change it from add to multiply. Now connect this color ramp here and this subtract here, and if we preview that, you can see that the middle values are much darker than the values on the edges. And to emphasize that effect even more, in this color ramp we can crease the effect. So as we move the black value in, you can see that the middle is completely black, which means that later everything that's black will be transparent and everything that's white is gonna be visible. So let's bring in this white value more to have a contrasty look. And now let's copy this color ramp and connect it between subtract and multiply so that we can crease the values of our Voronoi texture as well. And as you can see, we already have this sort of jagged electric arcs, but only on the edges of our metaball, which is perfect for our purpose. Now simply take the result of the multiply and plug it into Mix Shader Factor and change the emission color to something bluish. And now as you preview the Mix Shader, you can see that everything is solid. And that is because in material properties, you need to change the blend mode from opaque to alpha blend. Now to make it look even nicer, we can go to the render settings and enable bloom. And also in the emission node, we can bump up the strength quite a bit, maybe like 150. And now as you see, this already starts looking like electricity. So with the first particle done, let's make this viewport bigger, change the name from embol to something more descriptive, electric particle, and let's spawn them on our character. Now let's click on the mesh that you want the particles to be emitted from and go into the particle properties. Then click this plus button to add a particle system, and first of all let's go down to the render tab, change the render as from halo to object, and the instance object is gonna be our electric particle. Then change the scale to 1, and as you hit play, you should have the particle spawning. As you can see, it's terrible right now, but at least we know it's working. So let's pause it, go to the back, and let's start changing some values here. So first of all, we don't want our particles to fall, so we need to turn off the gravity, go to the scene settings and make sure that the gravity is off. Then we can go back to the particle settings, and here first of all let's change our particle spawn time. First of all let's change the frame start to -5 and the lifetime to 5, and then the frame start depends on you. If you want the effect to be always on, then make sure that the frame start is always minus whatever lifetime is, so that it has long enough time to pre-warm before you start the animation. And then the end is until when the particles should be spawning, so that just depends on the type of animation you're going for. In my case, it's gonna be 250 frames, so I'll change it to 250. Now in the source tab, let's change the emit from faces to volume, and now we can click play and see how it looks like now. You can see that the effect stays on the character now, which is great, but it's way too big now. So you can either scroll down here and change the scale from 1 to something smaller, or just keep it at 1 and play with the scale of the particle itself. I feel like something like this may be good enough. As you can see, it already starts looking like energy sparks, but the problem is, as the character moves, the sparks sort of just stay left behind. And then when it stops in place, then it starts being properly displayed. And in order to fix that, we can go into the particle settings again, and in the velocity, change the velocity of the object forward axis to 1 meter per second. In my case, it's Z, because that's how the character has been animated. I got it from Mixamo, so I don't really have control over that. And now as you can see, the particles are being shot forward in relation to the character, which is great. And now to keep them closer to the mesh that they are being emitted from, go to the physics tab, open integration. You can leave it at midpoint and just change the time step to the smallest value possible, which is 0.010. And now as you play the animation, you can see that the particles are actually staying on our object that they are being emitted from. Now the last thing we can do to make these sparks look more dynamic is animate the shader a little bit. So select the metaball, bring in the shader editor back, and in here, as you remember, we created those two values, seed and scale. We can just put in a driver into our seed value, and that will make our sparks phase through their seeds and give it more dynamic look. So simply type in hashtag frame divided by, let's say, 10. Now as we play the animation, you can see that the sparks are more dynamic, and they actually change how they look like depending on that seed value that we just changed. Now if you want to further adjust and change how the electricity looks like, you can play with the settings in the particle properties in the graph editor here. So have fun with that, make it as beautiful as you wish, but in order to not make it an hour tutorial, I will move to the next part. So the next part is gonna be also a particle, but this time instead of metaball we will use a plane. So Shift A, Mesh, Plane, and let's move it to the side as well. Let's then rotate it on the x-axis by 90 degrees and also scale it on the x-axis to make it rather tall rectangle, something like that. Now let's duplicate that, so Shift D and then R to rotate it, then Z to rotate it only on the Z-axis, and then 45 because we want to rotate it by 45 degrees. Enter to confirm, and then Shift R to repeat the same action once, twice, to have this sort of star looking mesh. Now select each of the plane that we created and then hit Ctrl J to combine them all into one. And now we can change the name Yellow Spark because that's what it's gonna be. Also make sure that with the mesh selected to hit Ctrl A and apply rotation and scale. This is important for our shader to work. Now let's bring back the shader window again, click new to create new material. This is gonna be Yellow Sparks. And now if you can't find the principled BSDF, you can simply click A to select everything and then comma on your numpad to focus on whatever you just selected. Then let's delete the principled BSDF and again create the emission, transparent BSDF and a mix shader. Let's connect it like with the previous one, emission on the bottom, transparent on top, and let's start with a gradient texture. Now with the gradient texture selected, click Ctrl T to get a mapping and texture coordinate and change it from generated to object again, and let's preview our gradient texture. Also change it from linear to quadratic sphere, and what we want is we want this sort of capsule shape that's not gonna touch the edge of our mesh, so that we won't have these ugly cutouts, but instead our particle is gonna flow from visible to invisible through nice gradient. So because this shape is longer rather than thicker, we need to also mirror that in the scale. For that we will need a value node, a math node, and a combine XYZ node. Now let's connect it like so. The value goes into our math node and also into X and Y, and then the result of the math node goes into the Z, and combine XYZ goes into the scale. And the math node is not add but divide. Now let's set the divide to 1 and the value let's increase slowly until we have our mask barely not touching the edges of the mesh. So maybe something like this. And now to elongate it, simply increase the second value from the divide node. Also just so it barely goes and not touches the edge of our mesh. Now with this sort of X shape done, we can add another math node after our gradient texture, and this time set it to power. And this will basically work as a smoother for our mask. So as you increase the power value, you can see that the gradient gets smoother and smoother. You can leave it as 1 and then adjust it later. I'm just letting you know that it's here if you need it. Now with our mask done, let's move to creating our actual spark. For that we will need actually very similar setup. So let's just move the texture coordinate somewhere here and duplicate those nodes. So simply select them, Shift T, put them right here, and then make sure that the texture coordinate is also connected to the second mapping node. Now create a noise texture, connect it to the mapping node, and let's preview how it looks like. Now this will be our sparks. So in order to make it more contrasty, let's add a color ramp right after the noise texture. We can crease it in a little bit just so we have the small sparks visible. As you can see, they are quite clumped right now, but that's what we have this setup for. As you increase the divide value, the noise texture is gonna get stretched more and more, giving us this nice result. So I recommend leaving it at something like 10, and then the rest comes from our noise texture. Let's bump the distortion a little bit, maybe something like 3, the detail as well, maybe something like 4. Let's lower the scale, and in the color ramp let's increase the contrast, just so we have the small particles visible. Now let's mix those two shader branches together using a math node. Let's change it to multiply and then connect both this color ramp and also the power. And this basically is gonna take this color ramp mask and make it only visible in this area right here. So that is basically what multiply does. So let's plug that directly into the mix shader factor, change the emission color to yellow, bump up the strength of the emission quite a bit, like 250, and then let's preview the mix shader. As you can see, we have the same problem as before. We need to go to the material properties and change the blend mode from opaque to alpha blend. And now we can already see our nice particle hanging in there. So now let's apply them on the mesh as well. Let's make this viewport bigger, go to our character, click on the mesh particle properties, and here with this plus button, we can create another particle system. Now instead of setting everything from the beginning, we can simply choose the existing particle system, electricity, and then click this icon, which is gonna duplicate this particle system, and we can name it yellow sparks, also here. And now the only thing we need to change in here is in the render tab, change the instance object, not electric particle, but this one is a yellow spark. And as you can see, we already have the base setup done. As you click play, you can see the particles being spawned, but now it just looks really bad. So for starter, let's scale down this mesh so it doesn't look so humongous. And the second problem is, as you can see, the pattern on every particle is the same, but luckily we can easily fix that in the shader editor. So let's go back in there, and right next to the noise texture, let's bring in a object info node, a value node, and also a math node. Then let's change the noise texture from 3D to 4D so that we get the seed value as well. And then from object info, let's choose random and connect it to the math node, the value as well. And we can either leave it at add or switch it from add to multiply and then put in any value here. This will basically alter the value of every single particle and then give it a different seed based on that number. So now as you can see, the particles look more randomized already. But now again, to make it look more dynamic, same as with the sparks, we can animate the shader as well. So because it's sparks and it's going from bottom to top, we can mimic that as well in the shader. So in the mapping node, we will want to put a driver in the location Z value. So as the value will change, the sparks will look like they are actually floating upwards. So let's type in hashtag frame again, divided by 80, and as you click play, you can see that the particles are actually moving, but in the wrong direction. So let's just put a minus before the frame, and that should fix it. But they disappear way too fast, and that's because we are using the same particle system settings as for the sparks. So let's edit that a little bit. Let's make the shader editor smaller again and go into the particle settings. Make sure that you're editing the yellow sparks. And first of all, let's give them longer lifetime than 5. Maybe something like 20 frames. And then remember to put the frame start to -20 as well to give them enough warm-up time. And we can also decrease the number of the particles to something like 600 maybe. As you see, this already started looking much better. Maybe they are still too dense, so maybe even 300. But then we have the same problem of the particles being spawned and then the mesh is moving and the particles are staying behind. So for that, let's again move down and make sure that the forward velocity, in my case Z, is strong enough to stay right around the same position as the object, but not too strong, because if you put it too much, then it's gonna just flow in front of the object, and that's also not great. So in my case, it's gonna be 2 meters per second, I think. Yeah, and that gives us quite a nice result. Now to reduce the yellow particles, you can either reduce the number in the particle system, or you can go into the shader editor and in the single particle, adjust the values on the color ramp right after the noise texture, which is gonna reduce the sparks on a single particle. So as you bring up the black value up, you can see that the particles are being reduced. Now, as you can see, it already looks like the guy from the intro. The only thing missing is that yellow energy fog around him, and that is actually super simple, so let's move into that right away. Let's take our yellow spark particle and duplicate that, and change the name from yellow spark to yellow fog. And in the shader editor, click this little icon again to duplicate the material and change the name again from yellow spark to yellow fog, because that's what it's gonna be. And here we just need to tweak a few little things. First of all, let's change the noise texture distortion to 0, bring down the black value from the color ramp, and most important, change the emission strength from 250 to 1. Maybe also play around with the scale of the noise texture, something like 5, bring the white value all the way up. We want this to look something like this. And then let's go to our character, again, plus to create new particle system. Here let's choose the yellow sparks. Click this icon to duplicate that and change the name to yellow fog. Here as well, yellow fog. Then scroll all the way down until render object. The instance object is not yellow spark, but this time it's gonna be yellow fog. And we can increase the number of the particles quite a bit, maybe to like 800, because we want it to be quite dense. So don't be afraid to bump it up quite a bit. Now as you click play, you can see that it's a little bit too dense. So select it and simply play with this black value in the color ramp again. As you bring it higher, it's less and less opaque. And to make the transition even softer, we can add another math node right after the multiply, change it from add to power, and as you increase the exponent, the effect is gonna get softer and softer, maybe something like this. Let's also maybe increase the scale of the particle, then make it a bit wider, so S and then Shift Z, so we can only change the scale of the X and Y value, like so. and also to not make it fly so high, we can go down into the physics tab and then increase the drag to something like 0.5 or even higher, like 0.8. Now one more thing we can improve in this yellow fog is that right now when the particle dies, you can see that it just disappears. And in order to make this transition a little bit smoother, we can go all the way down into the textures tab in the particle settings still. Then click new, it's gonna be our fog fade. Then into the texture settings, change the type from image or movie to blend. Now go down, change the coordinates from generated to strand particle. In the influence tab, uncheck the general time and check size, so that the texture is only gonna influence the size of our particle. Now all the way down in colors, check in color ramp, open it, change the alpha to 1 so that we can see what we're doing. And here simply drag in the values to control the fade in and fade out of our particle. Basically the black value is 0 and the white is 1. And because we checked in the size, we are controlling the size of our particle with this gradient. So as the lifetime of our particle progresses, it will start from 0, then become 1. We can add more marks, so it will stay 1. And then as it's close to disappearing, it can slowly, gradually fade into 0 again. So now as we click play, you can see that the particles are getting smaller before they disappear, so that the transition is way smoother than before. And that is it for this effect. Everything I used in the intro scene I showed you just now, so all there is for you now to do is go through all the values that we did, make them look however you want, and if you have any questions or suggestions, then the comment section is for you, or you can PM me on Twitter. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, I hope you learned something, or at least you're happy with the effect that you got. I never know how to end those videos, then I guess I'll just see you in the next one. Bye bye!